Good evening. Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Joshua David. I'm one of the two co-founders, along with Robert Hammond, of Friends of the High Line. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out on a rainy night for this wonderful presentation this evening. As many of you know, Friends of the High Line is the nonprofit organization that started the High Line, but we're the Conservancy that maintains and operates it. So all of the staff that you see up here is paid for through private philanthropic contributions raised by Friends of the High Line. So I'm sure many of you are members and supporters, and we thank you for your support. And if you're not, I hope you'll consider becoming a member. You can go online and find out about that. Friends of the High Line also, as part of the work that it does up here, is we present a robust calendar of programs and events, over 450 distinct events all year long, the majority of them free to the public. We've got a great one coming up on Halloween called Haunted High Line. Historic figures from railroad times are going to be scaring you and giving treats at the same time. That's on Saturday, October 27th from 11 to 1, so I hope there's a flyer out on the table for that. I hope you'll come for that and for some of our other programs. And for information about our programs, you can go to our website, thehighline.org. Tonight's talk is the final in a series of 4 talks entitled Beyond the High Line. The High Line gets a lot of credit, but as you'll see tonight, we're one of many exciting and innovative adaptive reuse projects that are taking shape all around the country. Past talks in this series this evening brought leaders from Chicago, Detroit, and the Lower East Side of Manhattan to discuss their projects. And you can go to our website and you can see videos of all of those talks. Beyond the High Line, this series is presented by Friends of the High Line in partnership with the Rails to Trails Conservancy, the Trust for Public Land, and the program tonight was made possible by the New York Community Trust Lou Esther T. Mertz Advise Fund. Tonight, we're very pleased to welcome United States Senator Mary Landrieu, David Waggonner, and Jeff Herbert to the High Line. Our speakers will be talking about the exciting work happening to transform old spaces in New Orleans into new, greener spaces, while also developing a comprehensive plan for sustainable water management. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our speakers who've all joined us here from Louisiana tonight. David Waggonner is president of Waggonner Ball Architects, an award-winning architecture and planning practice located in New Orleans. He is also the initiator of Dutch Dialogues, an exchange between Dutch engineering and design professionals and their American counterparts, focused on water-based urban design. David is currently leading the development of a comprehensive water management strategy for the greater New Orleans region, which he'll tell us more about tonight. Jeff Herbert is the executive director of New Orleans Redevelopment Authority, where he is responsible for redevelopment projects for the city of New Orleans. Since hurricanes Katrina and Rita, he has worked on many recovery plans for the city, including the Unified New Orleans Plan. The New Orleans Redevelopment Authority is working with Waggonner Ball via the Greater New Orleans Plan to implement the Lafitte Corridor, one of many new water-friendly projects. And we are especially pleased to have the Honorable United States Senator Mary Landrieu with us tonight. Among many important issues that the Senator works on, she is passionate about comprehensive community planning and smart growth. She has been the champion for progressive water management in Louisiana and actively promotes smart growth in many ways. Senator Landrieu recognizes that Louisiana has a unique opportunity to rebuild in smarter ways. She has seen revitalized cities and towns throughout the world and understands the importance of bringing new ideas and planning and design back home. I hope you'll please welcome Senator Mary Landrieu.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Joshua, so much, and thank all of you for the lovely invitation to be with you tonight. And I'm particularly pleased that I was able to convince my husband, Frank Snellings, who doesn't get out much, to come with me. So, Frank, would you stand and let them give you a round of applause? He likes to hang out, you know, in New Orleans and Royal Street, and then in Jimmy T's on Capitol Hill. So I said, you know, Frank, there are other places in the world. You know, we could go to New York, one of the world's great cities. So He came with me today. We took the train up, and we're headed back tonight. And it's also wonderful to be with our good friend David Waggonner, who's been a longtime friend of ours, the architect of our own home. He builds, as he likes to say, much bigger and grander things. But we're very happy to be with David, and he's really been a partner with me for many years now, even prior to Katrina, and then particularly after the devastation of our city. And with Jeff Hebert, who is just an extraordinary young leader in our city. Did we steal you from New York, or did you come here to school? Yes, he came here to school, and we stole him from you all, and now we won't let him come back. So he's running the redevelopment of the city of New Orleans with my brother, who happens to be the mayor, Mitch Landrieu. And we like to say we just keep it in the family. So we're thrilled to have his leadership. And his assistant, Kristen Milberg, and I'd like both of y'all to stand up. Jeff, stand up, and Kristen. Give them a round of applause. Two young people, thank you. Like a third of the population in New Orleans, Kristen is a young woman, very enthusiastic and excited, that came down to volunteer after Katrina devastated our city and region and never left. So she truly is representative of some really extraordinary talent and energy that is moving to our area from places like New York, Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco, Portland, and other places that really see it as a great frontier for urban design. Because unlike New York, that has a lot of choices, although we had a terrible accident, the whole nation suffered with you at 9/11, and we're still recovering physically and emotionally and spiritually from that. We really, when Katrina came, we lost about 80% of the city in its entirety. And I don't think that people can fully appreciate the depth of the destruction. Now, just so that I know what the audience is familiar with, how many of you have been to New Orleans, and don't hold on yet, to New Orleans since Katrina and got out of the French Quarter? Okay, great. So you're a fairly well-versed audience, and for those of you that haven't, so it's about a third that have been down there, and you can tell your friends and be witness to what I'm going to share just briefly tonight. And I know we have two other speakers that are going to go into a lot of detail about the particular project that we're here to talk about and share with you all. But first, I want to go back to just thanking Joshua and Robert, who's not here, but you all know, those of you familiar with this Highline project, that these were just two guys in the neighborhood that just didn't like what they heard about what was going to happen to their neighborhood. Neither one of them were the mayor, neither one of them were governor, neither one of them had $1 million. They might now, I don't know, but they didn't then. They didn't have any big fancy credentials about urban design, but what they had is what we need, those of us in leadership positions, others to join us, is a vision, is a passion, and an interest in making the place that they live better. And they just weren't going to allow the taxpayers of New York to waste a lot of money on tearing something down that could be rebuilt, rethought, recreated, that would add value to the community and increase the wealth of people in New York and save, not save something, but turn something that was unusable into something that is now treasured. And you know, that's the kind of action we need, and those are the kind of neighbors that I hope we all want to be, whether it's saving your library or recreating a park or cleaning up a river or a pond. If everybody would just take a little bit more care about the place that they come from and give it just a little bit of energy, it is, you know, amazing what can happen in America with a relatively functioning government. As a government official that's been under attack lately, of course, no one thinks we can do anything in Washington, but the fact is, if those of you travel around the world like I do, you know that a blessing is to have a government that can function and is honest and transparent. Democracy listens to the people. It doesn't happen perfectly, but it does happen here, and there are places on the earth where no matter how passionate you are, no matter how right you are, no matter how reasonable you are, the government will never listen to people like us unless you're connected or have $1 billion. They would not listen to two men or young men in a neighborhood like this to start a project. So let's give them a round of applause for what Joshua and Robert have done. And tonight, I'm just going to try to explain a bit about the city of New Orleans and South Louisiana and why we have to rebuild ourselves, and mention briefly the Lafitte Corridor project, which is what I think you all are here tonight to really hear about, because this is the High Line and beyond. And there are projects happening like this in some cities around America, ours is one, but also around the world, that the organization here that's created this and created so much energy and enthusiasm, you could be very helpful in giving support financially, but also just your own vision and passion for some of these other projects at a time in America where the government is not stepping forward as much as it should, mainly because of budget issues. You know, all cities and states are strapped for money. The federal government's running the largest deficit since the Second World War. There's not a lot of extra money hanging around and a lot of tremendous challenges. But those of us that are disciples of this movement, if you will, know that with just a little bit of money on the front end, but with a big vision and a lot of courage, and you've got to be bold, you can't do this around the margins, that you can create projects that literally generate hundreds of million dollars and billions of dollars of wealth and tax income for cities and communities. So Mayor Bloomberg is one of my heroes, and just want to thank him for his public leadership, and some of your city council members have taken this to heart. But real quickly, in August of 2005, the largest hurricane to ever hit the United States of America, and we have hundreds of them since we began tracking, hit the Gulf Coast. It was a Category 3 storm, but it packed winds of about 150 miles an hour. There were many special, devastating features of this storm, but one of them is that it was supposed to hit Florida, and everybody kept saying it was going to hit Florida, and then about 24 hours before it did, it completely reversed course and started heading towards Louisiana, which caused pretty considerable panic among those of us that live in Mississippi and Louisiana trying to get out. Because contrary to maybe popular notion, there are only a few highways going north. And you've got a lot of people to evacuate that live in the lower part of the country, in Mississippi and Louisiana. So if you can imagine sort of the terror of knowing that this huge storm, 150-mile-an-hour winds, and you've got to make very quick decisions. Do you go get your mother out of the hospital? Do you bring her with her, you know, in the car with her oxygen and ventilation tent? Do you unhook her from her life support systems? Do you leave her there? Families were making unbelievable decisions. Where do you go get your kids from college? What do you do with the thousands of Tulane, Loyola, UNO, Xavier, and Dillard students who were dropped off on Friday and the hurricane was going to hit? Their parents have already flown out of town. What do you do with these kids? Some of them had to swim out of second-floor windows to save themselves. I mean, it was horrible. The storm hits, it's Category 3, not a 5. It was a 5 out in the Gulf, and luckily at the very last minute, it turned in a way that was beneficial to the major metropolitan area of New Orleans. So actually the next morning, which is not known, the city had survived, contrary to popular belief. People were, I had evacuated the night before with my children at 4 o'clock. We were in Baton Rouge, 90 miles west-north of New Orleans. We had survived as well. The city had survived. The sun was out. And people were literally, you know, people had gone to the Superdome, and people were waking up and looking like, some people had gone to the Superdome looking like everything was okay. And then all of a sudden, water, streams and streams of water like tidal waves started pouring into the city. Because it wasn't the hurricane that destroyed us, it was the failure of a federal levee system that collapsed. And the city of New Orleans was flooded not by the river, which has been the great threat since the city was placed there 300 years ago. The city was flooded from a lake that's 26 miles wide and 12 feet deep. And because the city, which in large parts of the city was the marsh surrounding this great lake, at one time with great oaks and cypress trees that were all torn down in the last 200 years, and a city was built on a marsh, like many cities. Capitol Hill, between the White House and Washington, is built on the swamp of the Tigris River, amazingly. Same as the Roman great river in Italy, in ancient times anyway. In the same way, lots of cities are built. The levees broke, and people who had sheltered overnight, which many people do, particularly the elderly and the poor that don't have an automobile, or people that have an automobile but can't fill up 3 tanks of gas, and that sometimes is what it takes. At one time, you have to have enough money to put 3 tanks of gas in your car. To some of us that are in the middle class, this isn't a problem. For poor people, this is a problem. So they might have had a car, but they didn't have enough gas. So anyway, there were about 100,000 people, I guess, in the city out of 450,000 that had sheltered in place. And at the end of this horrifying night, where water started pouring in, about 1,800 of them had drowned. And all communications had gone out, all lights, no electricity anywhere. There was no food, there was no gas, there were no restaurants. There was absolutely nothing except for lawlessness and looting, not because people were trying to be bad, some people maybe, but they were just hungry and needed some food and needed some water. You saw the rest of the horror story. I'm not going to repeat it. But as a senior senator from the state of Louisiana through this horror story, it's been my #1 job to help rebuild not just the city, but the region. And New Orleans was 450,000 people. 80% of the east bank of the city, which is 2/3 of its entirety, was completely destroyed. And when I mean completely destroyed, I mean water came in and sat for 3 to 6 weeks, depending on what area of town you were in, from anywhere from 10 to 14 feet high. So for those of you that live on street level, just imagine, or if you've been in a restaurant lately or picked up your dry cleaners, just try to envision 12 feet of water in that dry cleaners, because that's what all of our dry cleaners look like. Every piece of clothing was destroyed. Every house was uninhabitable. And no one could get back in the city because it was so unsafe. You know, when people would say, what's wrong with those people from New Orleans? Why don't they just get out and start sweeping up the ground? There was no ground to sweep because it was underwater. And when the police came into our town, the boats were so high they could touch the red lights. I went in on a boat, and I could stand on a boat in the middle of a city, which is a bizarre feeling, because I've been out in the lake and on boats and in ships, but to stand on a boat in the middle of what should be a city and touch the top of a red light is pretty horrifying. That's how high the water was. So when we say in New Orleans that we're rebuilding the city, and my brother as the mayor is leading that charge, our former mayor tried and didn't have much luck for any number of reasons, but my brother's really put his shoulder to the wheel. Federal government's finally woken up. We've gotten some extraordinary things passed that have helped us to rebuild. But while we're rebuilding the city, we decided we want to save the best parts of New Orleans. The French Quarter didn't flood. In fact, it was funny when I spoke, the first ambassadors that I spoke to was the Netherlands ambassador, which I'll mention in a minute. The second was the Spanish and the French, because before we were part of the United States, we were part of Spain and we were part of France. So I laughed with the ambassadors of both countries and I said, you know, I have good news and bad news. I said, the good news is the part of the city that you all built didn't flood. The bad news is the part that we built did, and now we need your help to help us rebuild it again. And they've stepped up. We had many nations around the world come to us. So the long and short of this sad story, the happy and the only happy part I can tell you, after 1,800 people lost their lives between Mississippi and Louisiana, either drowned or died of the trauma, and tens and hundreds of thousands of homes were destroyed, and the federal government has now spent upwards of $150 billion to repair this damage. It's not just federal money, but federal insurance, you know, private money that's gone into rebuilding. For what I tell them in Washington is, if you'd just given me $1 billion or $2 every year, you know, for the last several years, I could have stopped the levees from breaking, and now you wouldn't be out of pocket $150 billion. And that's what happens when cities don't maintain infrastructure. That's what happens when cities let things decay. That's what happens when federal governments don't step up and be the reliable partner to cities and states. But nonetheless, so we're rebuilding a new city. And with the help of insurance that many people had, but not everyone. And some people didn't have it because you know you're not required to once your home is fully paid. So people didn't have insurance because they were lazy or didn't want to pay it. Many people in these neighborhoods had completely paid their mortgages off. And when you pay your mortgage off, you don't have to have insurance. So we've rebuilt many things. I won't go into it, but in conclusion to say, one of the things that we're thinking about, it really jolted the city as people started coming back. We now have 350,000 people back. We're about 100,000 short, but every week a new family moves back home or new people move in. We kind of discovered this Lafitte Corridor that had been closed, and it goes from, David will tell you exactly how long. How many miles, David? 3 miles? 3.5 miles through our city, and I don't think we're nearly as big as New York, you know, space-wise. So you can imagine you're building a 1.5 miles here. So we have 3.5 miles of our land that used to be a canal. And instead of the boats coming up from the mouth of the river to the docks right along where Jackson Square and some of you would be, where the big port is, there was a way the pirates found earlier on, and our early explorers, we call it the back way through New Orleans, from the Gulf through the Wrigley's, a little split where you could come into this bay, through the bay, across the lake to Lake Pontchartrain, and up Bayou St. John, and come into the back of the quarter, like on Basin and Rampart, for those of you that might be familiar with the city. So it was sort of a back waterway. And in the early days, it was used for trade when we had small boats and people were using mules to pull barges. Well, when we got big and fancy and created this big, sophisticated port, we just paved on over and just, you know, put grass all over this big space. And now, after Katrina, when great architects like David and Jeff are coming in to rebuild, we're looking at these things saying, oh my gosh, you know, we forgot this was here, and what can we do to make it better? So I'm going to end this and turn it over to the next speaker, just to say that as a senator in Washington, it has been my great honor to help rebuild a city where my father served as mayor in the 1970s, my brother's serving as mayor now. It gives me a great honor to be able to live the kind of admonitions that he would give me when I was growing up as a daughter of a mayor, that cities are important places. And the sooner the federal government realizes that and realizes the great strength of cities and stops stepping on their neck and sending them money to help them, the better off the nation will be. And when New York was defaulting in the 1970s, when John Lindsay was your mayor, my father was very young at the time. He's 80 now, much younger. He was the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and he had the great job of going around the nation and convincing the country what a terrible thing it would be if we allowed, when Abe Beame was your mayor in the John Lindsay, right after the John Lindsay days, would be a great terrible thing for the country if New York defaulted on its bonds. And New York didn't default. And the federal government and others rallied to the cause of New York, and some people stepped up and put some money into this city and would not let one of the great cities of the world, and perhaps the greatest city of the world, default on its bonds, and sent a very powerful signal. So the Landrieux and New York have been connected for a long time, so it's wonderful for me to be back to share some of what we're doing in a great city It's hard to think of the world without New York. It's really hard to think about the world without New Orleans, like where would we go to eat red beans and rice and jambalaya and fried oysters and kind of forget who you are and, you know, walk down Bourbon Street, sleep in the gutter every now and then, you know, get up and come home and pretend you're a respectable person. You know, that's what we do. So I thank you all for being here, and I'm going to continue my work in the Senate of the United States to fight very hard for funding, for sustainable development, for smart growth, for urban redesign, even with these tough economic times, to try to convince my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, that this is a really wise investment of taxpayer money, to believe in ourselves and to believe in the ability of America to reinvent itself. We do it every day, trying to create a more perfect union. God bless you all. Thank you so much. And I guess I'm supposed to turn it over to David Waggonner, thank you, who is the architect extraordinaire. And David, do you want to use that mic or this one?
All right. Thank you for being here, having us in the big city. Thanks especially to Mary, who's been the champion for the state since this man-made disaster happened. Thanks for Jeff, too, because leaders have to come in all different levels, and they progress over time. And so I think when you see Jeff, you'll understand there's a future leader here at a level right now where he can perform, but at a higher level as we go forward. The Lafitte Corridor is what we're here to talk about, but I'm really going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about the water strategy for New Orleans, the place of the city with relation to water, and then I'll talk some about the Lafitte Corridor. So I see something here different from what you see. But anyway, gotcha. That's next. Okay. So I'm supposed to look forward. That's what this is about, right? Lafitte Corridor is a rail corridor, but before that, everything in Louisiana was about the water. You know, the place was bought because, you know, 1803 was bought because of its location along the river. You know, the place is defined by water, by this river. You see the lake that Mary was referring to just above the city. Those of you who know this map know that that's not the way it really looks anymore because of the weakness of the wetlands, because of the leveeing of the river. The historic city that we have was the French Quarter. You know, the French and Spanish were there. They built on the high ground. A very difficult site, great situation. As the city developed over time, it spread along the river, along the high ground. As Mary was saying, when the flood came, the old city hadn't flooded because the first land built was the best land, like any farmer knows. But if you look at that picture to the north where Lake Pontchartrain is, you'll notice the waterways coming into that wet zone. As the city developed, and this is a picture of the Lafitte Corridor, it's really an enhanced version because our water's really brown. You know, it came to the back of the French Quarter. The Indians taught the white man that if you came in the lake, you could come through this bayou and you can go back out the river because America needed a trading point at the bottom of the river. It still does. What happened, though, over time, because of a drainage system we created, is we basically took the water out of the landscape. So this is a blue and white image, and you see New Orleans is right in the middle. Jefferson Parish is to the left, to the west, and this is what happened to the landscape in New Orleans. Even when we have water in the landscape, it's not there because we built these perverse walls that block it. These are the elements that failed at Katrina that have been left behind, like we left something in Iraq and didn't take it out. So that's what we have as a waterway. If you look at healthier water cities, this is Amsterdam, the ring canals, a good investment made a long time ago. You see the ring canals. If you look at Rotterdam, you see again the water in the city, the blue relation to white's very different from what we saw in New Orleans. And then you start to look at what that is, you begin to understand that these are linear assets and parks, these waterways. Europeans, we're European, many of us at root, think we figured it out. Well, there are older cultures that figured it out too. The Chinese in their delta figured it out. This is a town called Shaoxing in South China, and you see how much water they had in the landscape. The man who did this is a god because he tamed the flood. They dug a lot. They made a lot of space for water. There are forces in the landscape that are affecting us. The river, as Mary said, we have the rising seas, we have rainfall, and it rains harder than this in New Orleans, and we have this groundwater question, because our soil is really very weak soil. As this image shows, you know, our land is really thick water. So what you've got here is a condition where we've got to learn to balance on this weak soil. We can't treat it as if it was Manhattan. This is not a rock we're building on. We have a huge team working with us on this water strategy. We follow on the work that the Corps of Engineers has done. The Corps of Engineers has built a levee system, basically a fort around New Orleans. New Orleans has become a wall city, almost like a medieval condition. That wall, though, says we have to work within to manage the water within. There's really not so much variation between inside and outside the wall. You have to make it flow. This is our study area. Just for perspective, if you see the Jefferson Basin and the Orleans Basin, that's actually 90 square miles. That's 4 times the size of Manhattan. So the land area is vast. The density is not there. So that's an urban challenge. We work, though, as the High Line, as a renovation project. You know, if you're an architect in New Orleans, you get pretty good at renovation, but you understand that cities need to have renovations. So if you look there at the surface elevations, the green and blue and purples are below sea level. The city's about half below sea level. You start to see what we're working with. The reason we're below sea level was because in 1920, New Orleans, a New Orleanian invented the most powerful pump in the world. This pump drained the Zuyder Zee. It allowed people to move into the wetlands. It allowed all this activity that created what is really a tough problem. You see the drainage system that was built. It was a conveyance system to get rid of the water. That's not a good idea if you're floating. So then you see the red line juxtaposed on the black line, and you see the subsidence that we, men, women, induced. So we now have pieces of New Orleans that are 8 or 9 feet below sea level. That's not a healthy situation if you continue to ignore that or you don't understand what you're doing as you operate a landscape. So we're working with the discharge system. You know, the fact is that New Orleans, it rains a lot. You still have to deal with getting, you know, with a stormwater system. We're working with the system that we have, but we're also looking deeply into the soils. You know, we don't have the kind of rock you have here as a base. We have different kinds of soils, different underlying strata. So for planning in America, this is a different model to look at soil as information. We go back and look at landscape type for planning, and you see we have these lowlands to the green areas out in the north, and we have a back slope, and we have some bowls. Methodology comes back from the Dutch, which is, they say retain, store, drain. I think delay, store, drain is a better methodology to say it. But the idea is not to drain it as a first priority. So let me just show you what those things mean, and Jeff will show you a couple more, I believe, of what retain means or delay means. Because what it means fundamentally is slow it down. Don't let the water get in the pipe. This applies to New York. It applies everywhere. Get it out of the system. Don't let it get to the system quickly. It helps with quantity and quality. That neighborhood I just showed is an area called Pontilly, which is where the Environmental Protection Agency chief administrator grew up. Devastated now. There's a collection of lots, and what we have here is a scheme to connect those and allow the water to be intercepted to keep it out of that canal. In doing that, we can offset about half the flood problem. So storage, bigger scale. That's basically your middle version of the thing, and you have to look for spaces. Sometimes the spaces are there, they weren't developed. This is after Hurricane Isaac. This is water standing next to a park. That's a very natural system. Those trees are going to soak that water up and send it to the sky. That's a healthy landscape solution. There are other conditions, and this is one that I just show briefly because there's a 25-acre parcel in this devastated area of New Orleans that a certain order of nuns were on, and they're looking at not going back into that. The deep blue shows their parcel, but if you look at the offsets there, the progressive going toward light, doing one thing offsets the burden elsewhere. It's a connected system. So then you look at what that might be like, and you see that making space for water is a fundamental idea in a landscape like this. New Orleans has an opportunity to become an ecological city throughout, a healthier city. We can be a model for where the city and nature come together. And this is not an unattractive thing. APA has an image, a cut of that image on its cover right now, because this is a model for the rest of America, living in harmony with nature. There are also conditions very particular. These are not generic conditions, these are specific conditions, where along a canal at Dillard University, there's an opportunity to store water, create a wetland park. That's the wet condition of that park. What we get is, beyond the drainage system's capacity, we need to store water. Those squares, those things are 2.5 feet deep, and those little pieces are Jackson Square. 10 Jackson Squares is one of those bars, 2.5 feet deep. It's a lot of water we need to store. The good news is we have space. But we have to think about this. Now, if you think about a sustainable city, you wouldn't want to have a huge electrical bill, because that's a recurring cost that's just going to knock you out. Our current mode is to pump it all out. You see that storage discharge curve and flooding. So what we're trying to do is increase the storage to lessen the flooding, and what we really want to do is cut the discharge to nothing. Can't do it at all times, but you can do it in many events, because after the rain you need the water. So now we look just for a second at Lafitte and where it is. You can see that that red marker, I believe you see, is where the Lafitte Corridor is. You see how much flooding there is in the neighborhood. So if I look at this, it's not just a green space, it's a space that can soak up a lot of water, offset flooding. Now we move to that necessary last step, which is drain it. And in that case, we have made a suggestion to build on the existing drainage system, to decouple the drainage that's behind this ridge that was an old distributary from the lake. So this is an old idea. It really goes all the way back to the 1890s, working much more with nature. So there are different scenarios involved. So scenario one uses the system that's there and just redirects it, does pump to the river for 2 parishes together, Mary. And then you start to model the offset and the advantages of that. You see that there's a reduction in height of water. Just trust that that's what that's representing. And in the second scenario, where you build in more of that system, you start to collect more, but you also start to factor retainage and storage. Then you start to see a significant reduction in flooding. Repetitive loss is not something you really want in your insurance market. This is a program to reduce repetitive loss. And then in the future, there's a whole canal city that can be built out of a system. So getting closer to Lafitte now, we have this old city, and you see these long lines. New Orleans is replete with linear opportunities for parks. We have them all over. And what we envision is really a blue-green city. It's not just water, it's trees and water together, creating, you know, it's not cool down there in the summer, so more trees, more shade's a good thing. What you have here, last of these before I kind of summate and go to Lafitte, is really the eras of the water system in New Orleans. New Orleans is a water city that forgot it was a water city. This is something that is a new era for New Orleans to deal with urban water. I think it's a new era for the United States. It's just that we are in more dire circumstance than most. So our problems then are 3 identified. It rains too hard and it overwhelms. That's above sea level. We flood. Second, because we don't balance groundwater, we have the subsidence problem. Our infrastructure falls apart, so we have nothing to base our investment on. And third, perversely, we keep the water out of sight, which is peculiar. So you say, well, what do I need to do in an era of climate change? I need more space. I need to be able to manage this water for resiliency. That's a Western single Rotterdam example. This is the bayou in New Orleans, so this is really the connector point. This is the heart of the story tonight in a way. Use this water and don't drain it until you have to, and then use it to improve the quality of life, like you've used this corridor to improve the quality of life. So, Lafitte. Now the second part. Now, so this one comes in 3 parts, fundamentally. I don't always foreshadow what it is, but this is simple enough. This is the turning basin, the old turning basin at the back of the French Quarter. And this is what we had there a long time ago. This is what we have today. So, you know, it's not hard to do an urban comparison about which has more value. This is the Lafitte Corridor today, which is great if you're an architect and look for opportunity because it's city-owned property. This is what it was before. It was a canal. It was built in 1798. Okay, before it was a railroad, it was a canal. This is just history of transportation. And then we have this as a part of that corridor also today. not high value, but clear and useful. And then the point being made about where this is in relation to the French Quarter, so those of you who know something about New Orleans can understand where this is in context. It's basically your fundamental connection between at the origin of the city. There are lots of corridors. There is no other Lafitte Corridor for New Orleans because it's the core structure between the original bayou and the heart of the city. So I go north on this first, okay? This is the north part of this. It's an old railroad corridor that's fairly narrow. It's not consistent in width. It looks like that. Here's what it looks like in a map. You can see where it is. This is beyond the end of the bayou. And then you see in section, it's just basically it becomes a bioswale solution in our view, because you can have a pedestrian way, a bike trail. This is not the hardest part of the project, but it's a valuable part of the project, and it's probably a little less than, maybe it's a little over a third. Jeff, you'll know better. And then you look, because this is the problem with the work we're trying to do, every time we look at something, it grows, because the opportunities or the questions grow. I think this is a good thing for America, though. Look at the next problem. Try to anticipate what's the next thing. So we look here and we see that, oh, the Lafitte Corridor actually ends into another rail corridor that's in a railroad study to be decommissioned, so this corridor can connect around through this other corridor and more than double its length. And when you get into what that corridor looks like, it goes across the water, of course, because in New Orleans there's really water repressed everywhere. And you see that this becomes, you can imagine, a nice place to walk on this bridge across this water when this railroad's not there. So then we go back to the city end of it. That was the north part. So at the south end of the Lafitte Corridor, you have the old turning basin. This is now the parking lot that you know. And here's what it looks like as you start out of the French Quarter going north. When you do that, you see, again, the trajectory of this, and you see that crossing line there. The need for change in New Orleans is big. The problems of the past are evident, and that line is this highway that was built through, Federal Highway, Interstate 10, which bifurcated Tremé, which is the African-American neighborhood, absolutely a national treasure, and the French Quarter. It was driven through the middle of that neighborhood. There is a study going on, that's underway with the federal assistance to look at the removal of this, which we advocated and looked at. So this highway that cuts through the city, a business development idea of the 1950s, you know, it basically ruined a neighborhood, created urban blight. But if you look at what it can be in the future and you restore the boulevard, remembering that you need a water storage thing, and you see the crossing line of Lafitte here, you begin to understand the intersections of infrastructure, and that this park is really a key structure. I will explain a little bit more about the water aspect of that. I need to move so Jeff can do his part. I noticed the water floating. So then at the turning basin, the beginning of the thing, at this time, you have to plan with and without a highway. You need an adaptable section for, approach to the south end of the Lafitte Corridor. Those are two plans for that. And then you start to look at the water identity coming out of that, because, you know, water is this fascinating thing. It's fresh, it's salt, it's brackish, it's whatever it is, and there are all these different ways you can engage it through the Lafitte Corridor as a teaching tool. Here you see, you know, a cross section. Maybe some of you can read sections, like sections. We like to look at those and work on it a lot, but maybe you can clearly understand what we really have in mind, that this be a fresher system. And this is this is an opportunity in Wester Park in Amsterdam as an illustration, where you can actually let people engage water. People who haven't been around water need to be able to touch water. But water need not run in straight lines. This is an example we use a lot that's really from Brazil, much more like our climate. So then we come back to the key of it in my last part, which is Bayou St. John. It's a beautiful body of water. People use it, high-value real estate, but it just ends. And when it ends, it's just a collector of whatever debris. You might not want to see what's in there, and a drain. So right now, the energy of the city in this water sense is truncated. It's stopped. So the question is, how do we take this energy and move it into the Lafitte Greenway? So we began to look at how we create this water cascade, because the elevations, you know, There are many things I could bore all of you with. But we haven't, you know, it's a totally flat landscape by your view, but it's not really totally flat. So you have the opportunity to let this water come down, and when the water comes down, then you have this chance to get alongside it and connect the blue and the green and let this freshness and brightness show. So then the question is, what are you going to do along the Lafitte Corridor to deal with things like drainage? I haven't talked about that, but you have to use this corridor to offset the stormwater burden because we saw we had flooding in that area. The great news is there's space. The trouble of the infrastructure that's there, though, because this is a major drainage canal, the trouble is it's pretty hideous. And so how are we going to do that? The section above shows the current condition. What's unique about this was a very ambitious proposal that we would build a canal alongside a canal, probably too expensive, put water on top, which you would find in Tokyo. And then, but what we need to do, to be simple, is to allow water from the bayou to get into the water system, because we, as I'll show you in a minute, need a system. Water that's stagnant is not our friend. We did have yellow fever, and we don't want any more of that. So then what we're looking at is then how can you take something like that corridor, these aren't great drawings yet, but and how do you put a bike on top of it? How do you put a bike on top of that corridor and you put water alongside, and then when it really, really rains hard, you didn't have to pump it much, you could just let it be there because we have space alongside and we can still divert it, and water here is going two different directions. So the fundamental of the whole thing is to create a circulating water system. The Lafitte Corridor is the one key node in the city. It can get water to two different outfall canals. It can get water to the Claiborne Canal. There is no other piece of infrastructure in New Orleans that can do that, at least not as directly. And then what we get is a chance to transform something that looks like this now with a bayou, then turning into a green sward, and really no development along that, to something that would be more attractive and beneficial to the city. Mr. Hebert is next. Thank you.
So the Senator and David gave a very good introduction, and I'm going to really step back a moment and look at really what happens on the other side, on sort of the west side and the east side of the Lafitte Corridor, and how that relates to the redevelopment of the city of New Orleans. So, New Orleans Redevelopment Authority, we focus on affordable housing, commercial corridors, vacant land management and land banking, and neighborhood planning. And the neighborhood planning piece that you actually see there is the Lafitte Corridor. Reinvestment in communities, restore properties to commerce, and managing land and planning for the future. If you look at the regional context of the Lafitte Corridor, as David suggested, it really connects the French Quarter all the way up to the neighborhood that we know in New Orleans as Lakeview. And on either side of that is significant real estate holdings, and thinking about what the city could be like with the investment in the Lafitte Corridor, similar to what you have here at the High Line, although be it on a much different scale. So if you look at this picture, you see downtown New Orleans in the French Quarter. If you look just to sort of the upper right-hand portion of this picture, you can actually see the Lafitte Corridor cutting from downtown all the way through the city. The Lafitte Redevelopment Project, which is a HUD-funded redevelopment project for what was a housing project in the city that is now a mixed income project, as well as the Treme neighborhood, really focusing on that linear green space cutting through the center of the city. In addition to that, there are significant investments around the Lafitte Corridor, which go in the billions of dollars, almost up to about $4 billion in reinvestment as of today. The VA hospital and the University Medical Center hospital site, which is under construction, the Iberville housing redevelopment, the Lafitte housing redevelopment, Louis Armstrong Park, which opened last year, and this entire biosciences district that you see in the yellow, rethinking how New Orleans performs in its economy, really centered on the Lafitte Corridor and its transformation along and throughout the city. This is just more detailed. You can see all of the investment that's on either side of the corridor. But in particular, if you look down where it says Success Preparatory Academy, just on the other side of the planned site for the VA Medical Center, which is currently under construction, and the University Medical Center, which is under construction. That's an area that the Redevelopment Authority has really been thinking about as an area for redevelopment. Because of the lack of investment that you see on sort of the northeastern side of this picture, the southeastern side of this picture hasn't seen the amount of investment that we see elsewhere. So as David suggested, Lafitte Greenway running all the way from the French Quarter through Mid-City, the neighborhoods connecting the French Quarter, Lafitte, Treme, Mid-City, all the way to Lakeview. I think it's about 3.6 miles of a corridor, as we talked about before, was originally a canal system, the old portage, as they call it, connecting to Bayou St. John, then became a rail corridor, which was mule-driven, then became motorized, and then the warehouses and things like that set up shop over time, which created a very interesting land use situation, which we have today, which is mostly light industrial along the stretch of the Lafitte Corridor, and then going into the Mid-City neighborhood is light industrial that is seeing some redevelopment today. But really between St. Louis Street, North Claiborne Avenue, which is the elevated Highway 10 corridor, Canal Street, which is our main street in New Orleans, and Galvez Street, is an area that we've really focused on because of the potential for redevelopment, the potential for affordability, and the sort of underutilized nature of the property in that area that is just adjacent to the Lafitte Corridor. This is sort of what it looks like today. 88 residential buildings in good condition. 62% of residential buildings in a survey that we did are in good condition. 8 churches, a community center, a charter school, institutions occupying 15 parcels. The whole idea is that in order to connect the Lafitte Greenway and the investment that is going into the Lafitte Greenway, which is something that has come about since 2006 with an organization called the Friends of the Lafitte Greenway really fighting to bring that property back. How do we connect the residents in that neighborhood and the underutilized properties in that neighborhood to the transformation going on both at the Greenway and to the hospital complex that's going on just on the other side? You can see there are 90 vacant parcels in this area. 25% of the parcels are vacant. The square feet of vacant lots is almost 130,000 square feet. So there's a lot of potential, both along the corridor and what could happen as a result of investment in the corridor. 21 unoccupied buildings in poor condition, 19 unoccupied buildings in fair condition, and 20% of the buildings in the survey area are occupied in fair good condition, which means there's a significant amount of investment that can happen in this area, which is just adjacent to the corridor, that could really work well with the reinvestment in the corridor as it moves forward. The industrial lots, as we talked about before, significant parking lots. I mean, as everyone knows, in real estate, urban real estate, the best thing that someone can do when they own a property in urban America is they just sit on it for decades and they put a parking lot on it so they can make some revenue until they feel like it's time to put something back on the market. We don't feel that that's the best use of land, and so we're really thinking about strategies to reuse those strategies. So there are 2 things that we really thought of, and I'm only going to touch on one, is the St. Louis Street corridor, which is the street that borders the Lafitte corridor. What are some of the things that we could do to connect the neighborhood through St. Louis Street to the corridor, to bring some equity to the use of the project? And so we're working to support the future Greenway to ensure its success, work off of and between existing assets to develop a strong neighborhood core, and create a transition between the industrial and residential uses that already exist and are as of right zoning along the corridor. This is a picture of what that looks like as it really connects to the corridor itself. Streetscape improvements, mural and facade improvements, those sorts of things that make more of a connection between the neighborhood itself and the corridor as it exists today and what it will exist like after the investment that goes through the corridor. And really, as David suggested earlier, connecting the neighborhoods to the water. One of the things that David suggested earlier is that New Orleans turned its back on its culture of water for generations. And as we reintroduce water into the city, how can the neighborhoods that really are most impacted by that connect to the water features that can take place along this corridor, which I think is really fundamental to the people that actually live in New Orleans currently. Some of the ideas that we're thinking about are multifamily housing along the Greenway, mixed-use development. Lot Next Door is a program that we have for underutilized parcels that are next door to people who want to sort of buy those and take them on and maintain them themselves. Open space, new homes for with yards, streetscape improvements, which are a huge issue in New Orleans if you looked at some of the pictures that David showed earlier, and then mural and facades and warehouses that front the Greenway. The most important piece of this as it relates to this conversation is really what to do with the underutilized and vacant lots. And one of the things that we've been thinking through is best management practices for those lots as they exist, as being sort of the first barrier to deal with our stormwater and our regular rainfall before it gets into the streets and floods the neighborhood. So some of the things that we're thinking about are utilizing those vacant lots to retain stormwater, but also to be a really good passive natural feature for the neighborhood where you currently see either houses falling down or lots that have junk cars or other things on them, using it for two reasons. One, for really a landscape feature that improves the neighborhood, and two, to retain some of the water that floods the neighborhood on a regular basis. This is another example of what to do with using the public right-of-way, with some of the examples that if any of you are planners or architects know about as well, with bulb outs and other things, and being able to use those as water gardens to retain that as well. In combination with the lots, I think that we can do a lot of good to retain a lot of the water on site and not have it to flow into the system that then has to run out into the lake. So with that, this is just sort of a general overview of sort of the redevelopment strategies around the Lafitte Corridor. And with that, I think we're opening it up to questions for the three of us about what's going on in the Lafitte Corridor and in New Orleans in general. Thank you.
So if anyone has any questions for David, Jeff, or the Senator, I'd love to entertain a few.
How long is this project going to take?
Well, first of all, as you all can see with the presentation, the project really has yet to be really defined. And the city is still, I would say, in the preliminary stages of really coming together as a community about really what we want to do. David showed you the big picture. It's unlikely that everything that he showed you will get done, particularly the pulling down of that interstate, at least not in the near term. I mean, there may be an opportunity to do that. I've told him, and I'll tell you all, the federal government has no money to do that right now, and there's no money in the city to do it. So that's really kind of a far-off dream. But the part of this corridor that's not a far-off dream, and it's just a matter of getting it right and presenting it correctly to audiences like you and even to our own citizens and to the federal government, is if we could figure out a general master plan, like I'm sure that you all had a general idea of how you wanted this to look, and an idea about, I think it was a $100 million investment, which sounds like a lot of money, but the projection was if the city would give you $100 million to do this, you would generate $290 million or $300 million. Well, today, only a few years into your project, your projections have now gone up to $900 million, a return on the original $100 million that was put into this project. So once we kind of really come together, the leadership, both political, civic, and community, of what we want to do, I think it's presenting an idea of, okay, if we can pull together $100 million, we could maybe get phase 1 done in the next couple of years. So I'd say without the interstate, it's possible to get generally what we've seen done in about 10 years. But we have to have the right vision at front and let the private sector eventually drive this. I mean, once the public sector kind of lays out what generally should happen, it's really private money that's going to have to drive this redevelopment. There's not enough public money or philanthropy in the world right now to do this. I mean, if we were the only project in the world, we could afford it. But there are thousands of projects like this all over the world, and while we think ours is special, so does everyone think their project is special. Anything?
Hi. I'm wondering how much does the expected sea level rise factor into this project, and what assumptions are you using for that?
It certainly is motivation to swim faster. The levee around New Orleans gives New Orleans an opportunity. It ties into coastal restoration, because if you don't start restoring, if you don't start letting some of the sediment out before it goes off the continental shelf, then you've got less and less protection in wetlands outside the city. If you come back within the city, if you don't stop not managing the subsidence, if you start managing subsidence, you cease to go down. Your differentials are better. It's clearly a threat. That's the sea level rise, like the river discharge. Without some sort of program that puts water back in the city, I don't know how long the city has as an investment model. It is remarkable that the Dutch government has spent as much time, Dutch people have spent as much time working on this as they have. They like us, I think, but I don't think that's really the motive. I think they know it's possible to live in these kinds of places, but you have to coordinate your infrastructure investments, your urban design. You have to coordinate that a lot. I think we see 70% of the assets in the Netherlands are below sea level. So, you know, there are ways you can do this, but you can't just do it the way we did it in 1920. So it's a strong motivation.
Let me add something quickly that I think is a really important context, and I wish I had this slide to show you where the city and the region, when we talk about the city of New Orleans, it's New Orleans, Jefferson Parish, and St. Bernard Parish, which is about 1.5 million people. It's really not possible to relocate 1.5 million people effectively. Even if you could relocate 1.5 million people, which is really impossible to do and has never been done. We've relocated small towns of 100 people here and 1,000 people there, and, you know, towns in history that have gone under the volcanic ash have moved. We've moved towns north in Louisiana. We have been moving north for 300 years. There were towns, there were watermelon fields, cotton fields, sugarcane fields that are now open water. We've been retreating north for quite some time now because the Corps of Engineers, early in the history of our country, Thomas Jefferson purchased the mouth of the river, you all remember, leveraged the entire federal treasury to purchase it. It's probably one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on the entire continent of the United States. We would not be the United States today had not Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Purchase for 3 cents an acre. That's what we purchased Louisiana, 19 states for 3 cents an acre. So it was a very good purchase that's come back to us in many, many ways. The problem is that to tame this river, the Corps of Engineers levied it, which is why we're the greatest exporter on the face of the earth just about today. You know, we're getting some competition, but over time, the U.S. has been the greatest manufacturer and exporter. Why? Because we have a mouth of the river system, the Mississippi River, which those of you that know about the Mississippi drain 2/3 of the United States and provinces in Canada because of the way the Missouri, the Ohio flow into the Mississippi. When we channeled that river and tamed it, which was a great feat of modern history, we did it of modern times. What we didn't realize is we were also drowning a delta, because that's how a delta is created. It's like a hose, left like a garden hose with water shooting out of it. If you left that hose to go, a river naturally will change its course over thousands of years. And the Mississippi River itself built Louisiana and built a large part of the country. So we bought it, we found it, discovered it, bought it, tamed it, but when we stopped the river from flowing out over the wetlands, we've lost an exceedingly high number of acres. We're losing a football field every 30 seconds, a football field of land every 30 seconds without climate change. This is if the sea level doesn't rise at all. New Orleans and the entire southern part, the mouth of the river, which is part of Mississippi, Gulfport, New Orleans, and even a little bit over probably to Lafayette, is in serious danger. In fact, there's some National Geographic pictures that you might want to go look at and see what the mouth of the river looked like. And you could put your first slide up, David, your original one, and this is a very good thing to just see for 1 minute, because this is not a New Orleans problem, this is a New York problem. And this is a Chicago problem, and this is a St. Louis problem, and this is the most serious problem that I work on right now in, yeah, this one, the first one, that one. This is what New Orleans looked like when the city was built, and you can see where the city is, south of this big Lake Pontchartrain. That's where the French Quarter is, and it's still there. The problem is all of this yellow land that's sort of to the south of the city is virtually gone. There's no more marsh. All of this is open, virtually open water on the east, on the west side of the city, as well as these barrier islands. You see those all those islands? They're virtually gone. There are no more islands. The Corps of Engineers has just ripped this part of the country to shreds. Shreds. And what's happening is the water is now just like a monster. I mean, it's not really a monster, but it's acting like that, and it's just eating up the marsh at a ferocious pace because it's salt, and salt will kill a marsh. And it kills cypress trees, and it's killed the oak trees. There are no more oak trees, there are no more cypress swamps. It's just devastated. And my people are literally drowning, literally drowning. So the Corps, all the Corps of Engineers knows is how to build these big, ugly concrete walls. And what we're trying to explain to the Corps is this plumbing has to be really fixed and fixed quickly. And because it's costing the federal government a fortune. Every time it rains now in South Louisiana, people go underwater. But we can fix it, and it's not going to be that expensive. You just take this river, where it's now in this channel. It used to go, it created, all that river created all this land, and it used to just go back and forth over 1,000 years. But we can't have it move because, of course, it would devastate everything, and you'd never have commerce coming. 70% of the grain of the United States comes down this river. It is not trucked out of Iowa. It's barged out of Iowa, and it's barged out of Kansas, and it's barged down this river, and it's distributed all over to feed the world. And this river is the most important asset, one of the most important assets the United States has. And to New Yorkers, I have to say this, and I wish I had this slide, our port system along this river is much larger than yours. The port system on this river connected these 5 ports from those fingers you see down. A little bit north of New Orleans is the largest port system in the world by tonnage. And the country can't survive without it. And the people that run the river have to live relatively close to it. You're not going to be able to get thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people on helicopters and fly them out every day to run the river. They have to be able to live there. So we cut diversions in the river. This is what the scientists are saying. Let the fresh water from the river come out and fill up these marshes. Besides the navigation, all of the energy of the United States offshore, the continent of the United States, is produced right in these waters here. So most of the natural gas and oil for the whole country, more than what we import from Saudi Arabia, is produced off of this coast, and 40% of the fisheries. So everybody's fresh shrimp and domestic shrimp comes or spends some part, all the fisheries from many parts of the United States, their time is spent in these marshes. So the question of climate change, I mean, to us in Louisiana, even without climate change, we're going underwater. With it, many places are going to be in serious. Now, I'm not as familiar with New York State as I want to be, but I'm sure that you all have some parts of your coastline that are in serious trouble. And you remember in 1938, you had a Category 5 storm hit Long Island. And if that happens again, those of you from New York really need to think about what the consequences are going to be if a big storm comes up the coast. But this is probably the greatest loss, well, it is the greatest loss of land, and this is the 4th largest delta in the entire planet. And if we can figure out how to save this delta, then we can save the Mekong Delta, we can save the Niger Delta, and we can save the other deltas, great deltas of the world, where the earth makes its living. The people of the earth primarily make their living in economies based on water or water-related resources for commerce, et cetera, et cetera. All right, 1 or 2 more questions.
Hi, this is a follow-up basically to the flooding issue, but I'm very interested in knowing how this work, particularly with the new idea of the corridor and the best management practices, how does this work with FEMA and the basic regulations that FEMA has, and also the precedents that they have set in both New Orleans and other parts of the country about raising everything to the floodplain? Because in this case, I understood originally they were talking about raising houses 10, 15 feet, a whole story above the existing level. Later, that was sort of modified, I think, so that it was somewhat lower, and that was a kind of special dispensation. So how does FEMA work with this? And very importantly, how do the private insurance companies come in and adjust to this new thing so that they can give flood insurance to the homeowners? Because it's going to, when the new development is going to require mortgages for almost everything. You won't have many houses that don't have mortgages.
So it's a very good question. One of the first things that was done after Katrina in consultation with FEMA is, in order to finance the rebuilding of the southern part of the state, each of the local governments had to adopt what FEMA calls their base flood elevation. And those municipalities that did not adopt the base flood elevation were not eligible for federal funding. So I believe all but one local government accepted the base flood elevation standards, and so you have had rebuilding homes and businesses in some of the more heavily affected and higher flooding zones of the state actually did rebuild 10, 15 feet higher, 8, 3, depending on what they call the BFE was for that area. In New Orleans, because of some of the examples that David showed before, we're a city that has variances in the city. So there are some parts of the city that are not below sea level. There are other cities that are somewhat below and other parts that are very below. And so the strategy has been that whatever the base flood elevation is for each of those areas, and I think it's the same across the country, the coastal part of the country, South Carolina, Louisiana, all the way up to New York and Maine, is for flood insurance, it's based on whatever your elevation is. And so there are some areas that are outside of a flood protection zone because they're so far below sea level, and so they've had to elevate in order to qualify. But there are areas of New Orleans that are X zones, which means they qualify. I mean, they basically are not, there is no expectation that it would flood in 200 years. And those are some areas that did not flood with Katrina. So it's sort of a mixed bag. You have zones that flood, zones that don't flood, and zones that are somewhat in between. And there was a strategy to sort of link all of that together. But I think one of the smart things that the previous governor, Kathleen Blanco, did, and I know it was with some assistance from Senator Landrieu, was thinking through what could be done with the FEMA regulations for each of the communities that was affected, and making sure that both flood regulations as well as some of the building codes that relate to both floods and wind and all the things related to a hurricane were adopted in order to mitigate the risk going forward. And that was put in place after Katrina.
Jeff is right, but let me just add, and I think we're going to have to end on this. You all have been so patient, but let's just take Isaac 3-4 weeks ago. It was a Category 1. It acted like a 3. The hurricane stayed over the city and the general area for 60 hours. So I just want you to think about being in your home for 60 hours, 60, with no electricity and the winds gusting anywhere from 75 to 100 miles an hour for 60 hours. That's what a hurricane feels like. It's like being in a tornado for 60 hours. It's really frightening, or being in an earthquake where it just never stops. So then you wake up and you think it's gone away and it's still there. It's really maddening. And it's just the weather, and it's happening, and it's getting worse. So whether you're in some areas where the wildfires are just raging, or the tornadoes, or earthquakes, so that's what we're living with. Now, we live there, we know the threat. The problem is this: in Isaac, a neighborhood of 7,000 homes on slabs that had not flooded. There was one repetitive flood in the last 20 years. Those houses had 6 feet of water in them, and the water came in the middle of the night when people were sleeping in their beds. Can you imagine sleeping in your bed in a $450,000 home in a suburb, and you wake up because water is lapping on your bed? And you have to get out of bed in 3 feet of water, go to your kids' room, get them on your shoulders, walk to the front door. It's horrifying. This is what is happening in coastal areas because of climate change, because of sea level rise, because we've not taken care of our wetlands. We have not invested in the water management issues of this nation. And while we're kind of the canary in the coal mine, our people are drowning and dying and losing million-dollar homes. These are not shacks, these are million-dollar homes that people are losing. So we're not doing this the right way. There is a way to divert some of the money from oil and gas. Revenue sharing is a whole nother talk or lecture, but we believe that with a little diversion and sharing of federal resources that we actually produce off of this coast, we can replumb this river with the best science in the world. We have the Dutch helping us. There's no better people on the earth, in my view, than the Dutch. They're very involved with helping us to replumb this so that, yeah, some people can live 2 feet above sea level, but I don't have to go and explain to, 500,000 people that live on slabs or live on 2 feet, I'm sorry you don't like to walk steps, but you're going to have to spend, I don't know, what, $150,000 to elevate your home 17 feet in the air, only to have the house next door on the ground. I mean, that's what some of our houses look like now after Katrina because of some crazy federal rules that in neighborhoods just like New York, you'd have to go raise these buildings. It's like we can't really do that. We have to figure about attacking this a different way. So outside the levee system, we're raising. Inside the levee system, we're trying to have people live on a reasonable 2, 3, 4 feet above sea level and then manage our resources better. So that's the job I do in the United States Senate. This is a place of land, beautiful and worth saving, so rich in its diversity, so valuable to the nation and the world. We're so excited about what we can do. And the Lafitte Corridor is one small but significant project in a very, very special city on the earth. And like you all showed here, that Highline can be done. And you give hope to every big urban city in the world that with a little bit of imagination, you can have parks where no one thought a park could be. We'd like to let people see that you can have canals and open space, not just for the very wealthy, but for the middle class and the poor to be able to enjoy where they live. I shouldn't say poor, upwardly mobile, hardworking, poor people that are trying to make their way, to live in a decent place. So God bless you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Unless Jeff and David, you want to say anything else, I think we'll adjourn. Thank you for staying this evening, and we have fantastic music by the Baby Soda Jazz Band to end the evening for you, so thanks again.